I have taken some maker's license here. Hey y'all, it's Alirien, and today I am starting the final bodice for Alyce Pestle, and I actually technically have started recording this late because I got straight to work when I got home today. So I'm a little ahead, but I will catch you up on what's going on. So I cut out the pattern already out of this beautiful lightweight blue heather dyed linen. I really wanted the pale blue, and I liked the heather effect, and my mentality was that, you know, a fabric that wasn't consistently dyed all the way through would be less expensive and therefore easier to get a hold of for my working class girl. So I went with that, and like I said, I've cut out the pattern, and right now I am adding the heavyweight interfacing, which technically I could not find heavyweight interfacing at the store, so I have a stabilizer instead. This is a scrap of it, but this stuff, you can see already that it's a pretty stiff material, so that is going to be wonderful to prevent the boning that I'm going to be adding from poking through the outside and being noticeable, but it's also going to help with providing structure. Makes a lot of sense actually, because bodices, the Renaissance era is kind of the start of the evolution of women's undergarments into having corsets. Corsets technically do not exist until the 18th and 19th centuries. The immediate predecessor to the corset is stays. That's technically what you see like Elizabeth Swann in the first Pirates film being laced into as a set of stays. And before stays existed, the essentially first version of this sort of garment was called a pair of bodies, and it was only available to the wealthiest and highest class citizens. Elizabeth I had one. It's actually installed on her funeral effigy. But, you know, for women who were lower class, who could not afford a pair of bodies, or, you know, grandmother corset is what we're going to call it, lower class women would still stiffen their bodices for that structure and that shape and that silhouette. I don't know if they would use some sort of a starch, or I think something similar to a tarlatan or a buckram or something would be sewn inside, and that creates that stiff shape to it so that it's helping to compress everything ever so slightly into the fashionable silhouette at the time. The heavyweight stabilizer / interfacing is going to do exactly that, and it's going to look great. I already have a couple pieces already attached, and the way that they feel is wonderful, but I'm going to show you kind of the process I'm working with right now. I have another piece have this second front bodice piece. I'm cutting out the stabilizer to go on the back of the outer layer of the fabric, because this is a fully lined garment, and it's actually not bag lined. It is going to be edge bound. Technically, you're supposed to make a matching bias tape out of the material, but the piece for that uses up a lot of fabric, and I kind of want to save some of this for other things. So I did find a pale blue bias tape already made that I think will be close enough and will look lovely. So I'm actually debating going and getting some gray instead to bring the color of my petticoat into the bodice. I'm not sure though. It probably makes more sense to just bind it with the color of the fabric, because she'd only have a couple of skirts and bodices, and she wouldn't necessarily intend a bodice and skirt to go together all the time. So I probably won't do that. But it also leaves me extra for like binding the pocket openings and things like that, or if I want to do some other smaller projects here and there. Like I might take some of this linen to make a tea towel of sorts for her. I'll just cut out a big rectangle of it and bind the edges, and there we go. Right now what I'm doing is I have the main pattern already cut out in the linen, and I'm cutting out the stabilizer piece by piece and serging it together onto the linen that goes with it. This is one of the pieces that I've already done. It's not perfect because the linen keeps shifting underneath the serger, so it's bubbling a little bit, but I'm pressing it afterward as well to kind of press that bubbling to the very, very edge, so that once it's all sewn together, together, that bubbling will be caught in the seam allowance and it'll still be nice and smooth. I have thus far, where'd you go? There you are. I've done the center back piece already. It's fully stabilized and serged, and I've done one of the front pieces. So now I just have to do the other front piece and the 2 side pieces. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now.
Oh my god, my head is gonna explode. Wow. What's the pizza cup? What did you say? Not mine. I guess we cut him off. Well, it took him back when he should have. I'm sure it'll resolve if I just stay here. Yeah. I could buy some great towels. Couldn't have a customer at last. Good day. Yeah, damn. Mario, have a good customer at last. Did I already say that? Yeah, so don't use any ability. I should probably I should be like.
Now that the outer bodice is put together for the most part, there's like 2 seams left, but I can't do those, or I'm not supposed to do those until I start doing the binding. Now I'm just gonna follow all the same steps with the lining except for the application of any sort of interfacing. The lining's just plain old fabric. So I've got the same linen cut out of all the same pieces, and I'm just attaching the side to the front at the side seams, and my camera's picking up my wig head there, and easing the bust curve in, and then sewing the back piece to the front pieces at the shoulders. So yeah, let's do that.
That's like when you're like, there's so many places that aren't in Andorra. The Dominican Islands. That's what they do. Yeah, this was not a photo. This was not good. Where I was doing one last. This was you. This is This is me. So
taken some maker's license here. The instructions say to leave this seam open and attach the lining directly to this, like flat, stitch all around the edge, 3/8 of an inch in from the edge, and then sew up this seam after you start putting the bias binding around the arm side and the outer edges. But since I am planning on boning this, and also for the sake of making sure that it fit before I got too far to really want to fix anything, I went ahead and sewed up this seam because I don't care. The main reason they have you wait is because they want the bias binding to be visible back here down this seam. So you sew this, you're supposed to add the lining and then sew this seam the wrong way according to most manuals. Like you see how the seams are, or the seam allowances are on the inside, right? Well, this seam is supposed to wait till you have the lining on and then you sew it wrong sides together so that the seam allowance is on the outside, because then it was going to be covered with the bias binding. I have decided that I don't like that plan. I went ahead and sewed up those two seams on the outer bodice and we did a fitting, and we actually ended up having to, so I put the shift on and put this on over it. I held this portion, the front panels, exactly where they needed to be on my front, and then we smoothed out excess in a couple of the seams from there. So this seam is actually going to be tapered a bit more. We're taking almost 1.5 inches at the top here, and it's just tapering down to where the normal seam is, and then the shoulders are going to lose an extra 1/4 to 1/2 inch here so that they actually fit to my shoulders. And all of that should hopefully, once we pinned out that excess, this back section was sitting properly. When I first put it on, this upper portion over my shoulders was bubbling up because the bottom wasn't wanting to sit where it's supposed to. I'm gonna stitch out this excess and try it on one more time to make sure that I'm happy with the result. Also, I have realized I'm gonna have to do a bit of piecing because you can see on this side, these two pieces meet almost perfectly at the bottom. Binding is not gonna be an issue. It'll hide any sort of unevenness there because it's like a 1/2 inch, so it'll go in about as much as my fingernail is going up right there. The problem is on this side. That in and of itself is about a 1/2 inch difference. So I'm gonna have to cut some extra material and stabilize it and stitch it on in order to meet this line, and I'll probably just have it taper to where this meets, because this is fine. The back is meeting properly for the most part. Again, there's a tiny little gap there, but that'll be taken care of. I can even like shear off a little bit of that before I do the bias binding, and that'll be fine. This gap is what's too big, so I'm gonna have to piece on an extra little triangle and smooth out that seam allowance before I do anything else. I'm gonna stitch up the alterations on these couple of seams, and then I will do that bit of piecing, and then I can prepare to add my boning channels, which after a lot of thought, I think will be better served on this layer because this layer is thicker, it is stiffer. While I will have visible top stitching from putting the channels in place, it will still be more comfortable to have the boning here than to have it on the lining layer because that is just one thin layer of linen. I do have a fusible interfacing that I could put on the lining to make it a bit more stable, so that is an option if I still am not okay with the idea of the visible top stitching, but we'll see. For now, alterations and piecing. I got this pieced on. I actually ended up making the piece a little bit incorrect dimension-wise, but I just had to reduce the seam allowance at the top here, and it meets up almost perfectly at the bottom here. This little mishap here is actually going to be covered. All of this section here will be completely covered by the bias binding. I'll even stretch it a little bit in that spot to make sure it's covered. So now I am adding the twill tape for my boning channels, and I've already done this one because this one wasn't centered on a seam. It was just flat along the front edge, and I had to leave 3/8 of an inch of space because the lining will be stitched on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I went in 3/8 of an inch, and I will perfectly match this stitching as close as possible to add the lining on. And then I made the channel itself 3/8 of an inch wide so that it is wide enough for the 1/4 inch boning plus the boning's girth, if you will, because it's about 1/8 of an inch extra space that's needed. And I've marked a 1/2 inch up and down from the bottom and top respectively. So now I'm going to do the next ones, and for the ones that center over a seam, I tried to stitch this one on and it just did not stay consistently spaced from the seam line. So I've marked that vertically with some of the pins, and I'm going to slowly remove those pins as I stitch to make sure that the seam line is what is centered, not the twill tape. It's gonna look really wonky on the inside, but I'm aiming for, and what's funny is you can't really even make out the stitching on the outside. We're gonna hopefully barely be able to see the stitching, but if you can see it, I'm aiming for it to be perfectly parallel to the seam line, or as close as parallel as possible. Wish me luck on that. We'll see how that goes. Oh, and I did test the boning in this channel to see how it fit, and it was perfect. So we're gonna hopefully mimic that on the 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 more, because I have to add a second one here. I've got all of these vertical seams covered, and then I have 2 on the other center front edge. Wish me luck.
There's so many ways to be happy. You can do whatever you like. You don't have to be ready. You just gotta trust the right. Don't have to be scary. You just gotta follow the light. You're able to be happy. You can do whatever you like.
Okay friends, the boning channels are all on, and I've gone ahead and stitched 1/2 inch up from the bottom. So now I'm going to be inserting the wooden reed boning. I'm gonna start from this end and just work my way along, and yeah. Once we get that in, I'll probably stitch right along the top as well, just to keep it in place, and then we'll go ahead and add the lining. We're moving right along, friends.
I'm like you. You are like me.
edge binding, and it's as clean as I think I can get it on the outside. This corner was a little bit rough, but I'm honestly not worried about it. I don't think literally no one is going to be looking at my bodice that closely except for the garb coordinator, myself, and that one. I'm not worried about it being the cleanest possible. I just, as long as nothing's ridiculously noticeable. But we have edge binding on the arm size and on the entire outer edge. So now I'm going to mark where I want the grommets to go and make the holes and see if I can start setting some grommets. Finished bodice, and it fits beautifully and has, again, like the rest of the garb, gone through 2 whole festival seasons now and mostly survived. Obviously, using the wooden boning was a risk, it was an experiment, and I have now drawn the conclusion that it really should not be used in places where things bend. Quite literally, the first day I wore this at one of the rehearsals back in 2021, leant a little too far to one side and one of the bones snapped right around my waist. I think it was, no, that's a seam. I'm not sure where exactly it was. I think it's in the back somewhere. And then on both sides where the princess scene is, it has snapped underneath my bust, and this one actually I think has 2 fractures along its length. So it was a test and it didn't quite work out, so I'm gonna figure out something else when I rebuild this, because I am going to be rebuilding this bodice probably next week. So we'll be able to compare this one to the new one to see how I can improve upon it. I did punch the holes by hand with an awl, and I hand stitched around the edges rather than going ahead and using grommets, because I didn't want to risk that the metal of a grommet would show through the thread and show too much modernity. So I did sew it by hand with some light blue thread in a couple of shades because I ran out of one of my spools. And this is just a simple leather cord that I found in a set of gray, brown, and black leather cords that I have spiral laced, because I did the rows of matching eyelets and then realized that technically I shouldn't be cross lacing, so I should have offset them, but I left them normal so that I can wear this bodice for other purposes and cross-lace it instead if I want. So this one's going to be a bit more versatile. But yeah, it's super comfortable. Of course, because of the wooden boning, it can't go through the wash, so I give it a good steaming every now and then to kill off any bacteria and help get rid of any smell and get rid of any wrinkles. And I have a homemade vodka spray, old theater costume department trick of the trade, an old vodka spray to help with any odor as well. Here is the base garb. This is Alyce. I of course have a few more pieces to fully complete the ensemble. Next piece that you will see will be all 3 of my white linen accessories. I have, of course, the tie-on pockets that go in here and fill in this gap and allow me to carry things around the period accurate way, or period plausible way. I have an apron because I'm an apothecary. I work with all sorts of things and it gets messy. And of course I have a cap because everyone at that time in Elizabethan England would have been required to have some sort of a head covering. So women, at least if they were unmarried and of a certain age, would have to wear a cap to cover their hair while they were out and about and in public. Everyone was required to wear a hat. It worked out that wearing hats kept the sun off of you and kept your skin from getting burned anyway, but the hat requirement was also for the sake of individuals who made hats being able to keep business, and certain requirements were actually set up so that more people were employed and were able to be consistently employed and have consistent income, which is part of why Elizabethan England's economy was actually doing fairly well. There's a crow talking to me. There's a couple of them. Hello. Here she is. Alyce Pestle is nearly complete. As I said, we will have the apron, cap, and pockets coming up next, though you will actually be seeing a couple of VODs in the meantime. So after this video will be a VOD, and then the linen pieces, and then another VOD. I'm trying to alternate those until I get through my backlog, and then I'll get caught up on the VODs. So we'll see how that goes. I'm so stinking proud of this garb, as you've probably been able to tell in all of my videos so far, and I really cannot wait for y'all to see the finished product. And as we speak, I am working on 2 new smocks, and I'm about to start the new version of this bodice to replace my broken wooden boning that when I first put the bodice on, it is comfortable, but of course after wearing it for hours in a single day, eventually the spots where the wooden boning is broken will start to poke at me. I'm very glad I have the shift underneath here to help with that, and of course there's a lining to the bodice as well, and they're encased in twill tape, so it's not as bad as it could be, but it's still not the most comfortable thing. So making the new bodice will reduce how much I wear this one with the degrading boning. It will also give me some time to have a functional bodice to continue wearing for Alyce while I work on probably opening up this one for the sake of taking out the wooden boning and maybe putting some spiral steel in place instead. I don't want to use spring steel, that would be too rigid, so I'll either get some really good stiff cording or I'll use some spiral steel, because I already have some spiral steel on hand and I know where to get more if I need it. But yeah, here she is. Thank y'all so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, you've probably been on the internet and YouTube long enough, so you should know where all the buttons and the links are to show me that love, right? If you would like to see more content of Alyce, as well as any other costumes I have done, please check out the cards and the links in the description for my cosplay playlist. I will also have photographs of the garb on my Instagram page and also on my website. I would like to give a huge special shout out to my coven of patrons who have been the most pivotal in making content like this continue to happen and helping me make things bigger and better as I move forward. If you would like to join their ranks, please check the description below for my link tree. Patreon pledges start at $1 a month. Stay tuned for part 5 of my playthrough of the LEGO Star Wars series from my Twitch streams, and I will see you all again very soon. Keep aiming, my loves. Sláinte. At that time in Elizabethan England would have... It's Independence Day. People are shooting off fireworks. The wooden boning is broken. I can hear the pop every time one goes up.
I heard laughter, I heard music. I thought, baby, there's no way we could ever lose it. There's no way we could ever break or lose it.